And hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me again. Very pleased to be here. You've done part of my introduction for me, so that's great. What I'm going to present is a distillation of some of the themes from the last 4 years or so of doing research into CISOs. There's a fuller set that is going to be explored in future research. And just to give a baseline in terms of epistemology, this is interpretive research. In fact, it skipped on a slide, hasn't it? This is why I'm doing it. We talked about this. 18 UK-based organisations, but predominantly multinationals. And the pool of people, which I'll go on to shortly, is predominantly CISOs, but also senior leaders from those organisations. As I say, it is qualitative interpretive research. I'm not making any claims to generalisation, and it's been conducted by myself as a practising CISO. That may have resulted in me making some assumptions and interpretations based on that experience, but also there may be some advantages to having that background in order to be able to achieve some of those interpretations. So I'll talk briefly about some of the theoretical foundations that I use. Ontological security relates to the security of one's own existence, a sense of security of the self, as political scientist Jennifer Mitton refers to it. As such, it's very closely associated with identity. You can theorise of ontological security also existing at an organisational level, not just an individual level, whereby organisations are motivated to continue their existence, which is something that links back to a lot of management theory from certainly the 50s, 60s, 70s around organisational viability. And the part of the way in which organisations and individuals achieve ontological security is through something called identity work, which is dialogue predominantly that is used, but also signs, symbols, in order to create and maintain a particular identity. And organisations do this in the same manner as individuals. Organisations are driving to achieve ontological security, and in so doing, they may also develop individuals' ontological security, which I'll come back to. This is a very well-established concept that has been extended quite broadly, and identity is crucial to understand, as not only does it influence how individuals or organisations are perceived, it also has functional use. It is used in their interactions, in how it may also influence other actions that those individuals or organisations take in order to maintain or perpetuate an identity. So identity construction is achieved discursively, and it's important to consider the effects of language as constitutive of reality regarding a topic, and discourse that relates to identity, whether from yourself or from others, can tap into a broader reservoir of meaning, which is referred to as indexation. And metaphor and narrative are particularly important in indexation, and security discourse, as I'll talk through, often features very masculine metaphor, masculine narrative, particularly militaristic. I'll then discuss that in the context of hegemonic masculinity, which refers to the dominance of a particular type of masculinity within a plurality and a hierarchy of masculinities, and can refer to both men's patriarchal dominance over women, but also the hegemony, the dominance of some types of masculinity over other types of masculinity. And that dominance regulates masculinities, with the lesser, in inverted commas, forms of masculinity being excluded or seen as less important or less valid. And then finally, taking on those concepts of hegemony and dominance, I apply a lens of political philosophy based on the work of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' thesis, particularly from Leviathan, is one of structured power, the establishment of an effective society, and his philosophy is both political and moral, and has influenced a number of other major works, and has a considerable influence on modern society. So not too much then. So just a few theories. So I will quickly skate through this to get to some of the meat, but particularly for those of you who are academics in the room, this is just kind of backing up the methodology and the rigour that has been followed. It was a snowball sample. It was based on my networks. It was based on people that could be introduced to me through those networks. There was also some cold calling, for want of a better phrase, through LinkedIn, but also through other people that I knew in the industry who weren't in security. It was very difficult to gain access to senior leaders, but I did get hold of 5 senior leaders, so 2 CEOs, 2 CFOs, and a NED, as well as a CIO who kind of crossed over into both and that non-CISO role, but also had some security responsibilities. And as well as doing semi-structured interviews with those individuals, each company's most recent annual reports were analysed. So in total, 21 participants over 18 companies. The data was coded inductively using NVivo 12. The data was then thematically analysed following Braun and Clark, who I'm sure several of the psychologists in the room will be familiar with, and was also used another number of analytical techniques from Johnny Saldana. There was extensive use of diagramming, some of which I will show. This gives you a snapshot of the types of industries that the organisations surveyed were involved with. Now we can get to the meat. So, findings. This is necessarily limited, and I've focused on some key themes rather than presenting everything. Otherwise, we would be here all day, and I would just be reading my thesis to you. So, the first set of themes, fear and assuagement. Cybersecurity was very consistently associated with fear throughout the data. This included the impacts of cybersecurity incidents on the company, which could affect its continued existence. Media reports played a part in that association with fear, such as news of breaches occurring at other organisations, as well as nation-state attacks and threats to critical national infrastructure. Cybersecurity incidents were seen as inevitable, they were seen as ever-increasing, they were seen as sophisticated. And CISOs were both comforters to their organisations in the face of that fear, but also bad news merchants. They brought some of that fear out. We've already heard Inka talk about fear appeals. So they had a conflicting role of both identifying problems and stimulating a fear response, as well as being the person that provided solutions to those problems and providing assurance that those organisations were protected from threats. And protection was another theme. So CISOs were protecting their organisations. Those organisations were being menaced by outside threats, and they were fearful of intrusion. Characterisation of the CISO as a guard was identified not just from the interview data, but it was also in the annual reports, where similar language was used to describe cybersecurity functions and CISOs as protecting the organisation. Militaristic concepts, language, and metaphor were common throughout the data, and as with fearful aspects, mass media was a contributor to this, but so were governments. There were also internal conflicts within organisations, and CISO interactions with senior leaders were commonly confrontational. The data suggested that the ability to succeed in a relatively hostile environment was normatively a necessary trait of a CISO. These organisations were keen to position themselves as strong and robust. This was clear both in annual reports and in the interview data, particularly with senior leaders. Words indicating strength were commonly repeated throughout the data, with multiple synonyms being used. Other than strength, there was a prevalence of masculine language and metaphor, both to cybersecurity and to business in general. Cybersecurity was predominantly characterised as a technical pursuit, with non-technical aspects being described as soft or fluffy or similar. As well as being technical, it was very clear from the data, that was close, wasn't it? I'll hold that. It was very clear from the data that cybersecurity was seen as an interpretive practice, that the domain was not well understood by senior leaders, and with CISOs needing to translate and interpret meaning for them. Cybersecurity was seen as a continuum, with the CISO needing not just to make judgments, but also, not just to interpret, but also to make judgments. So where should we be on that continuum? And that judgment process was seen to be art, not science. Cybersecurity was characterised as an expert system, using Giddens' definition of expert system, not the AI version, with CISOs having access to a range of specialist knowledge and specialist skills that enabled them to make those recommendations to their organisations. And this resulted in them having considerable power. And not only was the topic of cybersecurity arcane, it was mysterious. And as the quote on this slide shows, it was seen to be impenetrable. It was seen to be everywhere. It was also clear that cybersecurity was imbued with morality, with there being a sense of right and wrong and good and bad. This fed into the conception of the CISO as a form of police, who was identifying wrongdoing and applying penalties to wrongdoers. CISOs were involved in determining and implementing controls, many of which were surveillance in nature, and which characterized the organization's broader staff as potential wrongdoers. CISOs also saw themselves as agents of edification, that they were making their companies better, that what they were doing was a vocation, it was a cause, it was even a belief. These aspects, again, provided the CISOs with considerable power. And yet, whilst being powerful, CISOs were also precarious. They were very conscious of being scapegoated for cybersecurity incidents, and many of the CISOs expressed this concern explicitly. But CISOs also felt somewhat detached from their organizations, like they were being kept at arm's length by some, even being seen themselves as a potential threat. And these feelings, combined with that position as expert advisor, as specialist interpreter, may motivate self-serving actions that I've referred to in one paper as cyber sophistry, with the CISO being in a very powerful position of identifying, assessing, and proposing responses to threats that only they can understand. These experiences were in part related to the multiple and often conflicting identities that CISOs occupied. And the diagram on this slide, which I appreciate may be difficult to read at the back, summarizes some of these other identities, which I won't go into in detail, but there's a few things to call out. This sense of whether cybersecurity, that dot doesn't work, cybersecurity is part of IT or is not part of IT was a real sense of conflict. And again, across the organizations, very different views came out. But also another thing on here, which I'm slightly biased about because I'm also a bass player, but there was this real sense that the CISO was a bass player, that it was something you would only notice if it wasn't there. It was really important, but it was in the background. And again, that kind of, be interesting to look at that from a personality perspective, linking to what Inka was talking about. But that was definitely seen not just by themselves, but also by their stakeholders. So I'll now discuss these findings through analytical lenses that relate to identity, ontological security, masculinity, and power. These lenses were indicated by the empirics with the data suggesting those lenses. So these haven't been determined a priori. These are themes that came out from the data. So just to recap, identity work refers to the tactics used by individuals or organizations to construct and maintain an identity. So the CISOs in this study were performing identity work, partly in response to threats to their identities that arose from a sense of ontological insecurity, that is, insecurity of their own existence or their own sense of being. Not only were their jobs potentially at risk through scapegoating, but their professional identity was just not well understood by their stakeholders. They didn't understand what they were there to do, they didn't really understand the subject that they were specialists in. So in response to these feelings, the CISOs created or maintained a protective identity for the organization and positioned that as being essential to the organization's ongoing viability. And part of this included being a moral expert for the organization, advising them on what was right and identifying what was wrong, in the context of the organization being exposed to threats from bad people that could, as one senior participant put it, result in nasty things happening. So again, that moral indexation was very, very clear throughout. Soothsaying was developed as a particular theme during the analysis stage. And this metaphor is useful both from the perspective of providing a framework with which to summarize certain findings, but also as a way of expressing that conflicted and precarious position that CISOs occupy. The term is not intended to be denigratory, and indeed, as a practicing CISO, I certainly wouldn't try and denigrate what we do. And soothsayers historically were highly valued, and as discussed in the paper I presented at CSCW last year, soothsaying can actually be seen as more akin to weather forecasting than to astrology. But this soothsayer identity is particularly useful for the CISO, but also it supports an organization's own identity work. If an organization experiences ontological insecurity as a result of perceived cybersecurity threats, it's likely to perform its own identity work in response to that insecurity. And the existence of a CISO is often mentioned in an organization's annual report, as it was in many of the cases in this study. Such statements build prestige, they build status and legitimacy. They help to legitimate the organization. And in that sense, the CISO is a totem. It's a symbol that is serving to indicate to the organization stakeholders that it's protected, but also that it's doing the right thing. The soothsayer identity is particularly beneficial to the CISO in helping them establish power, even if that power is precarious. As soothsayer, they can predict an ever-increasing number of sophisticated threats, which may deter their stakeholders from considering their replacement or removal. There are also benefits accruing to the wider cybersecurity industry, which benefits from increasing spend on cybersecurity solutions to those opaque, ever-increasing, and sophisticated threats. Another complicated diagram. This reflects codes and categories of data from the analysis. And what this is suggesting is that there is a complex cycle with regard to ontological security, cybersecurity, and identity work. And of particular note is that the identity work that the CISO performs might indirectly contribute to the ontological insecurity of the organization through fear appeals. The use of fear appeals supports continued presence of the CISO in the minds of their stakeholders by using a narrative that's exciting. And exciting cybersecurity narratives and associated media frenzy were common in the findings of this study and are common elsewhere. These help to maintain the existence of the CISO and other cybersecurity professionals in the minds of their stakeholders. Viewing cybersecurity threats as potentially existential to the organization may motivate that organization to construct through dialogue, both internal and external, an identity that is protected against those threats. Articulation of this identity then feeds the organization's sense of ontological security, becoming self-sustaining unless something happens that contradicts or undermines that identity. Articulating or demonstrating that they employ a CISO is an example of this identity work at an organizational level, but then that sustains the identity of the person who is performing that role, giving them a greater sense of ontological security as the person who has got a clear identity, as a defender, but also as a person who is valued, necessary, and therefore likely to continue to be employed. So identity work that relates to cybersecurity can be seen as beneficial to both parties, organization and CISO, and this can, of course, be extended to other interested parties like the cybersecurity industry, but also governments and state identity, as I will come on to shortly. So I move on to talk about masculinity, and masculine tropes are ingrained in cybersecurity discourse, and this was very clear from this study. The militaristic associations of cybersecurity may lead to or encourage cybersecurity professionals to cast themselves in a heroic role and to mythologize their work. Heroism is a traditionally masculine concept, and while being a cybersecurity professional may not be as traditionally masculine as some other professions, it is a highly male-dominated industry, and it is also glamorous, and it is therefore emotionally rewarding to be associated with, due to its associations with national security, organised crime, and high salaries. Cybersecurity professionals may develop or maintain discourse that casts cybersecurity as a military concern, encouraging that narrative of defence against enemies in order to construct a heroic identity and secure their status. And again, that links back to the precarity that many CISOs feel. And through this identity construction as a hero, as a defender, as somebody who is protecting the organisation, you build ontological security. And a sense of security and comfort both within organisations but also within wider society can derive from an identity that is well respected, that is well known. And therefore an identity that is being recognised as heroic or worthy may provide a greater sense of ontological security than one that is considered either by yourself or by others to be trivial. And that can become self-sustaining. An identity as an expert is also masculinity. It's more subtle masculinity than being a hero, but is equally powerful. The expert identity that was occupied by the CISOs in this study was a technical and therefore masculine one, as technical competence is associated with masculinity. As well as the CISO accruing a masculine association from being a practitioner in a technical field, they also accrue masculinity from being the leader of that field. Self-assignment of an expert role is a common form of identity work in organisations and is more common in men than in women. So defining oneself as an expert, whether explicitly or implicitly, may be another mechanism of achieving that ontological security of self. And that's particularly important if an individual feels that their identity or their masculinity is under threat. Men typically compete to establish their identity and relative social rank through proving technical capability. And men who base their identity on their technical expertise may have a fear of being unmasculine if that expertise is questioned, such as if a breach occurs. The CISOs in this study were also agents and enforcers of discipline, acting as organisational police. And many participants wished to avoid that characterization, but it was still the case that that was how they felt that they were seen by the organization. The CISOs and their staff taught staff about the existence of cybersecurity threats. They communicated a defined set of rules. They indoctrinated them into acceptable behaviors, monitored their compliance, and punished them when they transgressed. Cybersecurity incidents, as with attacks on national security, may be humiliating both for the CISO and for the organization as a whole. And the risk of humiliation associated with such attacks may provoke compensating performances, such as displays of strength. The organizations in this study clearly position themselves as being defended from attack and as being strong, as being stable, as being rational. And cybersecurity incidents were threatening to that identity. Humiliation through such an incident is also further gendered by the use of phrases such as breach and penetration. And the anonymous nature of most cybersecurity attacks, at least in terms of there not being a clearly responsible party, may also be emasculating. Therefore, the risk to the masculine identity of a business from cyber humiliation may encourage masculine behaviors and attitudes that are focused on avoidance of that humiliation, including making public displays of strength and preparedness. But that also serves as status differentiation, which itself has competitive undertones, and being seen as better than other companies attracts more investment and a more favourable reputation. Therefore, being better than other organisations with regard to protection from cybersecurity threats is a masculine display, which is further enhanced by the militaristic associations of the topic. Homosociability is a phrase particularly taken from Michel René Gregory, which refers to the use of certain concepts and narratives that support male bonding. That provides not only a grounding for communication between cybersecurity professionals, but also between those professionals and business leaders who are more likely to be male. Using masculine metaphors and concepts of warfare, attack, defense, heroism, and technical expertise to define one's position and to describe one's responsibility achieves a common ground with those for whom those metaphors resonate, which is particularly important when your subject is not well understood. So metaphors of war, sport, and engineering may be the lingua franca for discourse between dominant masculinities, at least in Western businesses. These displays form part of what Judith Butler refers to as the heterosexual matrix, which defines what is culturally acceptable and is based on heterosexual norms and is highly exclusionary. These masculine aspects of cybersecurity have a regulatory effect, both on those who work in the profession and on those who do not. The use of militaristic language and concepts perpetuates this masculine bias that features in broader security discourse, so broader than just cybersecurity. Discourse that utilises tropes of protection from enemy threats gives a system of constraints and excludes those for whom such identities are not desirable or available. So by defining the identity of cybersecurity professionals in a particular way, including technical expertise, including the protection-oriented aspects of the role, as well as the hierarchical nature of the profession, where the CISO sits at the top, it creates a metaphorical iron cage of identity that is inherently masculine. Regulatory effects can also be observed with regard to the disciplinary aspects of cybersecurity practice. So the implementation of cybersecurity controls results in an organisation regulating identities of its staff such that they become the surveilled, but also potential wrongdoers. This further constrains the identity of the CISO as being both police and judge. Militaristic discourse may deter anyone, regardless of gender identity, for whom a military identity is not aspirational. And such discourse may therefore be implicated both in the overall skills gap in cybersecurity and the lack of female representation in the industry more broadly. Exclusion may also result from the specialist language, whether militaristic or otherwise, that appears in cybersecurity discourse. The incomprehensibility of this language may be weaponized by cybersecurity professionals in order to secure their status and exclude those who do not understand their language, and through exclusion to create and maintain power. And the reference to the fluffy side of cybersecurity in the data is an example of how activity that isn't deemed worthwhile, or at least somehow lesser, becomes feminized. Those references imply a dichotomous hard side to cybersecurity, which results in exclusion by establishing difference, but also sets an ideological foundation for unequal treatment and establishes a hierarchy, whereby some identities are seen as more valuable than others and therefore have a higher status. Anti-identities such as these can also be used disparagingly, both to define one's own identity as well as that of others, and to diminish them in the process. This can also be seen more subtly in the distinction between technical and non-technical aspects of cybersecurity practice, with those non-technical aspects becoming a form of subordinated masculinity, which is established largely through an association identification with femininity, ghettoizing non-technical activities and branding those people who perform them. I've talked for a long time, and now there's going to be a more complicated diagram, which you're not going to be able to see from, probably even from the front. I'm very happy to send this out, but there is a complex cycle here, and there are 5 intersecting cycles shown on this diagram. The first, which is labelled with 1, indicates an interaction between governmental discourse and that of the cybersecurity industry, with an associated link to broader power structures. That discourse feeds into the militaristic associations of cybersecurity that feed into the next cycle, which is shown with a 2. These contribute to the conception of cybersecurity as adversarial, which is further supported by the existence of cybercrime and the associated need for protection. This adversarial aspect is one contributor to the sense of cybersecurity as an expert system, which is shown at number 3. This is also fed by the technical aspects of the role, underpinned by the complexity of the topic, which feeds into the need for education and interpretation. This gives rise to a number of masculine metaphors which exist in a bidirectional relationship with multiple masculine aspects of business more broadly. These are supported by various self-serving aspects of discourse that link back to number 1, and certain aspects of each of the cycles at 1 to 4 feed into the central cycle of cybersecurity as being both protection and domination. And it's not my intention with this diagram to suggest and indicate or suggest any sense of causality, but it is intended as part of a broader analytic process to identify potential relationships, potential linkages, and to show that the phenomena I've discussed do not exist in isolation. They are part of a much more complex system, which I will be exploring in future research. And finally, to talk about maintenance of power structures. So the masculinity of cybersecurity discourse implicates those broader power structures. Discourse that relates to cyber war and associated fear provides a means for those in power to define or to repeat who and what are threats and the relative urgency of those threats. And in so doing, the state can maintain a broader narrative of fear, war, friend and enemy, good and bad, and right and wrong. Such narratives were consistent throughout the data, but in particular, the association of moral threat with cybersecurity was consistent. A moral association may strengthen the power and importance of these threats for citizens, but also result in an unquestioning acceptance of them. By assigning a moral dimension to cybersecurity, citizens may be discouraged from challenging the need for intrusive controls associated with it. Therefore, cybersecurity may offer a channel through which sentiments and beliefs that are beneficial to states, such as people being continually under threat and therefore needing protection from the state, can be maintained, such as those relating to enemies or the questionable dualism of security versus privacy. There are further benefits for the association of cybersecurity with discipline and punishment. Organisations in this study required obedience from their staff with regard to cybersecurity in terms of compliance with policies and controls, as well as alignment with standards of behaviour. Obedience, whether through completion of mandatory training, through compliance with those policies, was mandatory, and non-compliance would be punished. As well as disciplinary action, non-compliance could also result in impacts on staff remuneration, particularly at a senior level. So the potential for the organisation to remove a level of security from its staff in terms of the security of continued employment and continued income suggests what Barkan describes as an immunitary dynamic. So as with Hobbes's Leviathan, these businesses were providing protection in exchange for obedience, and if this obedience was not received, their protection could be removed. The mysterious and expert nature of cybersecurity also provides a source of what Hannah Arendt refers to as new props, which support existing power structures. Due to the ephemeral and difficult to understand nature of cybersecurity, these props are effectively never ending. So there is a bottomless well of bad things in the world of cybersecurity from which society needs to be defended and therefore existing freedoms surrendered. Companies within the broader cybersecurity industry accrue benefit from that state of insecurity. This may be exploited through a narrative of unforeseeable risks, fear-stimulating consumption, in the same way as war. As Mark Nicholas describes, the security and defence industries always need there to be something to be defended against. So as well as cybersecurity being one of these industries, cyber capability is a factor in being allowed to play in others, and can be a barrier to entry, which indeed was found in this study. Cybersecurity is thus enmeshed with a much broader aspect of modernity in the sense of continued consumption, both as an industry in its own right and as a facet of other industries. States, therefore, which seek continued and never expanding growth can stimulate expansion by a need for spending that counteracts fear and anxiety. That's taken from Baudrillard. Where that fear and anxiety is generated by unseen and ever more sophisticated sources, like the world of cybersecurity, there is, in theory, no upper limit to the growth that could be achieved. So in summary, cybersecurity plays an important role in business identity, being both a threat to and a constituent of that identity. This includes the indexation of aspects of morality, which support a desire from businesses to appear to be righteous. I've also explored the identity of CISOs themselves, which is conflicted and contradictory. CISOs are expected to perform multiple roles and are at once precarious and necessary. They are scapegoat and totem. I propose that one of those roles is akin to being a soothsayer, building on the moral and mystical aspects of cybersecurity, to suggest that the CISO is an interpreter and judge of fearful and arcane threats and uncertain signs, and they are a protective and yet somewhat disquieting figure. Cybersecurity discourse is highly masculine, and as well as this being regulative of identity in relation to both practitioners and the subjects of practice, it may serve to exclude those for whom a traditional hegemonic masculine identity is not desirable. Cybersecurity is also enmeshed with broader power structures through militaristic associations and with aspects of surveillance and consumption. So in this brief overview, I've shown that the role of the CISO is conflicted and complex. The purpose of the CISO is multiple, it is varied, it is misunderstood, and yet it is powerful. It exists to advise and to educate, to interpret and caution, to protect, but also to signify protection. For a briefly touch on some implications arising from this. So future research may benefit from bringing these lenses and other sociological perspectives into conversation. So in particular, the lenses of identity work and broader social contexts derived from international relations study may be of value in further contextualizing cybersecurity practice. As I will explore in future work, there are opportunities to challenge the use of militaristic and other traditionally masculine concepts in cybersecurity discourse. But in relation to practice, the study suggests that it may be of value to acknowledge and even embrace the interpretive aspects of cybersecurity and put greater focus on the communicative, advisory, and evaluatory aspects of the CISO role. Seeing the CISO as a weather forecaster rather than as a totem would be beneficial for all parties, providing greater clarity on a role that is poorly understood. And if cybersecurity is considered to be mystical and opaque, should education perhaps focus on dispelling this perception? Or conversely, if cybersecurity requires interpretation, should education make this more explicit and focus less on teaching people about cybersecurity and more on how to use systems safely, with security aspects being implicit rather than explicit? However, this could be problematic if it results in users becoming powerless and dependent on technological protections. As with scholarship, those in practice could consider whether alternative, less exclusionary metaphor and concepts can be employed in referring to cybersecurity, and whether this could help to improve representation and close the skills gap. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all my research participants, obviously without whom I couldn't have done this work.
Is that on? Yeah. I feel like I've got about 10,000 questions. I'll just ask two. Were any of your CISOs female in the study?
No, they were all male. Yeah.
Do you have an audiobook? I feel like I need to listen to that about 9 more times to take it in.
Thank you. I will consider that. I'll talk to some publishers. All of the CISOs were male. Not all of the participants were male, though. They were, of the other participants, there were 2 female non-CISOs. I tried to find female CISOs. I had 2 lined up and they both pulled out, unfortunately, due to work commitments.
Do you think it would have impacted the findings in any way had you had female CISOs?
No. And I have had this conversation informally with people outside of the realms of the study who are female CISOs, and they are equally using the same metaphor, and they are equally not considering the masculine aspects of some of those metaphors, which is quite an interesting debate.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Hello. That was great. Given the attritional nature of being a CISO, which it is at board level most of the time. How do we change the dial so that the less technical aspects are presented in a positive manner so that they can represent them properly to a board that wants to be seen to be protected?
Very good question. Part of that, I think, is dialogue directly with boards and with board communities. Funnily enough, I was at an event with a load of non-execs on Tuesday night, which was about cybersecurity what do board directors need to know about cybersecurity? And I kind of snuck in because it wasn't intended for me. But we had some really good conversations there, and the lack of understanding at that level of what questions they need to ask. And one of the participants in my study, one of the non-execs, said, I asked them, how do you know whether your CISO is doing a good job? Like, well, there's various questions that I will ask them, to get a sense of it. So how do you know what questions to ask? I generally rely on someone like you. So we're feeding them the questions that they need to ask us in order to know whether we're doing a good job or not. And if what we're doing is saying, oh, well, you need to ask all of these technical questions, that, again, just reinforces that identity.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
Really interesting research. I read your CSCW paper, and I thought it was a really fascinating, unique perspective on the CISO role, so thank you for that. My question is also related to the non-technical aspects. It seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect because they tend to use and emphasize technology, this technical expertise, but yet part of their role is, for example, acting as an interpreter, which requires strong communication skills, being able to tailor the message. They have to deal with internal conflicts, which requires strong interpersonal skills. So it seems like they're practicing these non-technical skills to be successful, but they're downplaying them. So I'm wondering, how do they reconcile these, seemingly opposing types of skills, and do they talk about the type of skills that's necessary for the role?
Yeah, some CISOs, certainly in this study, but also in my broader network, are very comfortable and are very, they foreground the non-technical aspects of their roles, whereas others tend to see that as a little bit of a pain, that the reason that they need those interpersonal skills is because everyone else doesn't get what I do. And building on that, there were also a few people in the study who clearly would fall back on the technical side of things, and that's what they really wanted to be doing. And again, that sort of sense of, I'm doing something secretive and look at all the charts that I've got and isn't it exciting, and I'm defending against nation states. A lot of people prefer to be in that dark room with all of their graphs rather than actually sitting in front of business leaders and having normal, in inverted commas, conversations. But it is changing. But one of the things that's come out of this is that clearly there are different demands on the CISO, there are different roles that we perform, but also that the variation between individual CISOs is very, very broad. And there are, again, it's quite a wide spectrum of the technical CISO all the way to the non-technical CISO, but boards equally are certainly demanding one over the other. And there are plenty of businesses around here that I won't name that I will never get a job with because I'm not technical enough, because I'm not a computer scientist. And that's what they look for. They want somebody who's doing that. And again, whether you can link that back to the masculinity of some of these businesses would be interesting to look at. Thank you. Thank you.